In 1977, a movie was released that changed the film industry and sent a ripple through the US economy. That film was Star Wars, later retitled Star Wars Episode IV: A New Hope. Star Wars was the first in a series of movies that would become one of the most successful film franchises in the world. The first movie was such a hit, fans lined up around the block to see it. Star Wars ran in theaters for 18 months. After its official release in 1997, 20 years after the movie initially premiered, the first Star Wars film had earned over $775 million worldwide, $1.5 billion in 2017 dollars. Most people did not expect Star Wars to be a box office hit when it was first released. As the film's director George Lucas recalled, "I didn't think the film was going to be successful. Neither did 20th Century Fox, the film studio that funded the movie-making process, which did not allocate much monetary support to market the movie. Star Wars' marketing team was able to advertise the film among comic book and science fiction fans, but did not generate a lot of buzz otherwise. As a result, few theaters wanted to show Star Wars. If you had the opportunity to see Star Wars when it first premiered, having no knowledge of how popular the franchise would become, would you have been particularly interested in this film? Probably not, unless you were a comic book fan or were interested in science fiction. Now assume that after seeing Star Wars in the news, you decided that you wanted to see it. How long would you have been willing to wait in line? After the film's premiere, some theaters sold out seats for every showing for weeks at a time, and fans waited hours in line for a chance to see it themselves. Star Wars' success is more than a story about a box office hit. From an economist's point of view, it is also an illustration of demand and of how demand can change. In this lesson, you'll learn about demand and its partner, supply. You'll explore how price and other factors influence what customers demand and what producers are willing to supply. More on that. Most people's understanding of demand comes from their own experience as consumers. Consumers, after all, are the ones who decide what to buy and how much of it to spend. Demand, in this everyday sense, is whatever consumers decide they want. But how do we make those decisions? Consider this scenario. You are shopping for movies online, and you see that Star Wars Episode IV: A New Hope costs $15. Do you buy it? Would you be more likely to buy it if it were priced at $11? What about if it were priced at $18? If you respond the way economists expect you to, the lower the price, the more likely you would be to buy the movie. This is a key idea in understanding the relationship between demand and price. Anyone who has ever gone shopping knows that making a purchase depends on two things. You have to be willing to buy the item in question, and you have to be able to pay for it. Those two characteristics of consumers, willingness and ability, both matter to economists. You might want the newest cell phone, for example, but if you don't have $1,000, you cannot buy it. You see an older model cell phone priced at $500, but you do not like it enough to spend the money. For you to contribute to the demand for either phone, you have to be both willing and able to buy it. What does it mean to contribute to the demand of something? Let's say that you do, after all, buy a model cell phone for $500. That one phone at that one price is what an economist would call your quantity demand. Quantity demanded is the amount of goods or service that consumers are willing and able to buy at a specific price. If a different store were to charge $400 for the same model and consumers bought 30 phones, them would amount at that price to then the bidder would announce at the particular auction, or you would see it in the store that it would amount at that price. 30 phones at $400 each. That would be the quantity demanded. When each of the quantities demanded at all the various prices at which a good is sold and added together would result in demand. Demand is the amount of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to buy at all prices in a given period. Demand is expressed in terms of a time frame, such as per day or per week. To say that consumers bought 14 million iPhones does not, to an economist, convey demand. But 14 million iPhones purchased in 1 month is demand. In fact, it is an enormous demand, and every consumer who bought an iPhone during that period at any price contributed to it. Price is obviously important to consumers. How important is it? A simplified model of a market can show us how prices can influence consumers' buying decisions. Suppose that Tyler is the sole consumer in a market with one product: tacos. Assume that the tacos sold in this market are all exactly alike. This is the ceteris paribus, or other things being equal assumption. Also assume that prices is Tyler's only consideration. Tyler eats tacos several times a week at a taqueria or taco stand owned by Jasmine. One day Jasmine conducts a customer survey to find out how Tyler might react to a price change. The survey asks how many tacos per week Tyler would be willing and able to buy at various prices. The results of Jasmine's survey are shown in the table in Figure 5.1a. Economists call this kind of table a demand schedule. An individual demand schedule lists the quantities of a good that one person will buy at various prices. Tyler's demand schedule shows that at a price of $1, his quantity demanded is 9 tacos. That is, he can be expected to buy 9 tacos per week when the price is $1. Notice that as the price increases, the quantity of tacos that Tyler is willing and able to buy decreases. The data that Tyler's demand schedule are plotted on the graph in figure 5.A. Each pair of variables in the demand schedule is a pair of coordinates, marking a point on the graph. The line that is formed by connecting the points is called a demand curve. A demand curve shows the relationship between price and the quantity that buyers are willing and able to buy. As the price changes, the quantity demanded moves up or down along the demand curve. Notice that this demand curve happens to be a straight line. Demand curves can be straight or curved. As you might expect, this demand curve shows that Tyler is able and willing to buy a lot more tacos at 50 cents a piece than at $3 a piece. In the real world, of course, Jasmine would need more than one customer to stay in business. Suppose she opens the doors to her taqueria to the general public, a move that gains her 3 more customers, Amber, Kayla, and Lewis. She now needs to consider the market demand for her tacos. Market demand is the sum of all the individual quantities demanded in a market. When economists refer to demand, they are usually talking about market demand. Knowing market demand helps businessmen make plans for their businesses because it tells them how many goods all consumers will buy at various prices. To determine that broader demand, a business might track sales of a product at various prices, or a business owner might conduct a survey. Jasmine again uses a survey to determine the demand for her tacos. A schedule of the data is shown in figure 5.1b. It shows the sum of the quantities demanded at each price by each of the 4 consumers. The sum is the market demand for Jasmine's tacos. The accompanying graph shows the same market demand data. Each point on the curve represents the quantity of tacos demanded at a particular price. As you might expect, there is a clear relationship between price and demand for Jasmine's tacos. One thing is clear from both of the demand graphs you just looked at. As the price of tacos increases, the quantity demand decreases. As the price decreases, the quantity demand increases. Price and quantity demanded move in opposite directions. This inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded is so strong that economists refer to it as the law of demand. Economist David Henderson calls the law of demand the most famous law in economics, and the one that economists are most sure of. Why do price and quantity demanded move in opposite directions? The answer can be found in 3 factors that affect consumer spending behavior. Sometimes a consumer has to decide whether or not to buy something, like a movie at a particular price. Other times, however, as the thinking at the margin principle tells us, consumers are faced with the choice not of whether to buy, but of how much to buy. This raises the question of marginal utility. How much utility or satisfaction is there in consuming just one more? The law of diminishing marginal utility tells us that with most goods and services, the more we have already consumed, the less satisfaction we are likely to get from consuming yet another additional unit. This explains why each helping of food you eat at an all-you-can-eat buffet is less enjoyable than the one before. Does this mean that people will not buy even ever larger quantities of good or service? No. But it does imply that they will do so only if the price is low enough. Because of scarcity, people's incomes are limited. They have only so much money to spend. If the price of a good or service increases, they will not be able to continue to buy the same quantity as they did at the original price. Sometimes two different goods can satisfy the same want. Such products are called substitute goods. Flip-flops, for example, can satisfy the same want as leather sandals for many people. What happens if the price of sandals increases relative to the price of flip-flops? At some point, people will substitute the cheaper good for the relatively more expensive one. All three factors cause consumers to react in predictable ways to a change in the price of a good or service. As consumers buy more in response to a decrease in price, or less in response to an increase of price, the quality demand is said to move along the demand curve. Economists call this movement along a curve a change in quantity demanded. Only a change in price causes a change in quantity demanded. As the law of demand recognizes, price is key when people are deciding what and how much to buy. But other factors can influence demand as well. Suppose, for example, that a street fair was held on the block where Jasmine's taqueria is located. She might be mobbed with customers. The demand for her tacos would certainly increase. Or suppose a blizzard brought the city to a halt. If this occurred, Jasmine would have very few customers for a day or two, and the demand for tacos at all prices would decrease. How would these changes in demand be reflected on a graph? Movement along a demand curve shows how the quantity demanded changes as the price of a good or service changes. But sometimes a factor other than price, such as a spike or a drop in the number of customers, causes an entire demand curve to shift to a new position on the graph. Economists call this shift a change in demand. A change in demand occurs when quantities demanded increase or decrease at all prices. The market demanded schedule in Figure 5.2 shows how the change demand for tacos affected the economy. The original market demand schedule for Jasmine's Tacos appears in the middle column. The column to the left shows the increase in market demand for the week of the blizzard. The column to the right shows the increase for the week of the street fair. Each demand curve on the accompanying graph corresponds to one of the three demand schedules. The demand curve in the middle shows the original market demand for tacos. The curve to the right shows an increase in quantity demanded at every price, and the curve to the left shows a decrease in quantity demanded at every price. Both the decrease and increase in market demand have caused the entire demand curve to move. When a factor other than price alters demand, economists say the demand curve has shifted. An increase in demand shifts the demand curve to the right, and a decrease in demand shifts it to the left. Economists have identified several demand shifters that can cause a change in demand for a good or service. We will consider each demand shifter as if it were independent. Ceteris paribus, however, everything is interconnected. Generally, an increase in income increases people's demand for goods and services, and vice versa. If you like movies, for example, you probably go to more movies when you are working and earning money than when you are not. When the economy is growing and jobs are being created, more people earn more income. The demand for many goods and services increases at all prices. That is, the demand curves shift to the right. The opposite also holds true. In an economic downturn, incomes and demand can decrease. The demand curves for many goods and services shift to the left. A change in the number of consumers can cause market demand to shift. You saw this effect in the taco stand scenario, when the street fair brought in more customers and the blizzard prevented customers from coming. In some markets, this effect is seasonal. In a summer resort town, for example, market demand for hotels and restaurants increases when summer brings an influx of consumers. When summer ends and the tourists leave town, demand decreases sharply. Consumers do not necessarily buy the same products year after year. 60 years ago, only a small number of Americans ate sushi, and they did so mainly at Japanese restaurants. Today, sushi is so popular that it is sold in many supermarkets. This change in consumer tastes has caused an increase in demand for sushi. The demand curve for sushi has steadily shifted to the right. Advertising can play a powerful role in shaping consumer preferences. Suppose, for example, that a producer of sunglasses was to launch an advertising campaign with celebrity endorsements. At all price levels, quantity demanded would likely increase. The demand curve would shift to the right. Prices don't actually have to rise or fall to cause consumers to change their behavior. Consumers may decide to buy or not to buy based on the expectation of a price change. Let's say you go into a store with the intention of buying a particular video game. You find the game, which is priced at $59.99. A salesperson informs you that the game will go on sale next week for $39.99. You put the video game back. The expectation that the price will soon go down has, for the moment, lessened your demand. A change in the price of one product in a pair of substitute goods can cause the demand curve for the other goods to shift. Take burritos and tacos, for example. If the price of burritos were to increase, the law of demand tells us that people would buy fewer burritos, which would cause movements along the demand curve for burritos. At the same time, assuming that the price of tacos did not change, consumers would tend to buy more tacos instead of buying burritos. Market demand for tacos would increase, and the demand curve for tacos would shift to the right. Other pairs of substitute goods, including fish and chicken, sweatshirts and jackets, and movie tickets, and Blu-ray rentals. A complementary good is a product that is consumed along with some other product. Tennis rackets and tennis balls are complementary goods, as are hamburgers and buns. Demand for one complementary good increases and decreases along with demand for the other. So, for example, if the price of printers were to decrease, the quantity of printers demanded would increase. As a result, demand for the ink cartridges that would go to the printers with the printers would also increase, assuming the price of the cartridges remains unchanged. The demand curve for cartridges would shift to the right. Opposite every consumer in a market exchange is a producer. Producers supply the goods and services that consumers demand. They decide what to supply and how much to produce. How do they make those decisions? Price plays a critical role for producers, just as it does for consumers. Jasmine, for example, might be willing to sell a certain quantity of tacos for $2 a piece, but would she be willing to sell the same quantity for $1 a piece? Economists can safely predict that our answer would be no. The lower the price, the fewer tacos Jasmine would be willing to sell. This is a key idea in understanding the interaction between supply and price. When we look at the supply side of the market, we find that the same concepts and terms that apply to consumers also apply to producers. The same ceteris paribus assumptions apply as well. All tacos are the same, and price for now is Jasmine's only consideration. All other variables that might influence supply, including the cost of ingredients, are held constant. Suppose, then, that a customer wants to buy as many tacos as Jasmine is willing to supply in a week for a big party. However, Jasmine is only willing to supply 300 tacos at $1 a piece. Her profit at that price is so low that she is not interested in producing more. At a price of $3, however, she is willing to supply 500 tacos to the party giver. Each of these amounts is a quantity supplied. Quantity supplied is the amount of a good or service that producers are willing and able to offer for sale at a specific price. When we add up the quantities that Jasmine and other taco producers are willing and able to sell at all prices, the result is supply. Supply is the amount of a good or service that producers are willing and able to offer for sale at all prices in a given period. Like demand, supply is also expressed in terms of a specific time period, such as weeks or months. A look at Jasmine's supply schedule can help us understand how price and supply interact. A supply schedule is a table that shows the quantities supplied at different prices in a market. The individual supply schedule in Figure 5.3a shows the quantities that Jasmine will supply at different prices. Notice that as the price increases, the quantity of tacos that Jasmine is willing and able to offer for sale also increases. The data from Jasmine's supply schedule are plotted on the accompanying graph. Each pair of variables from the schedule, quantity and price, is a pair of coordinates marking a point on the graph. The line formed by connecting the points is a supply curve. A supply curve shows the relationship between the price and the quantity that producers are willing and able to supply. The supply curve shows that Jasmine will offer many more tacos for sale at a price of $3 each than she will at a price of 50 cents each. Jasmine's Taqueria has thus far been operating in an imaginary one-producer market. A more realistic scenario would be a market with multiple producers, each one contributing to the market supply of tacos. Market supply is the sum of all the individual quantities supplied. When economists refer to supply, they are usually talking about market supply. Economists studying markets have several methods of determining market supply. One is to keep track of production figures, how many goods each firm in a market is producing. Another is to survey firms to find out their quantities supplied at different prices. Suppose that Jasmine now has two competitors in the taco market, Aleda and Joshua. A survey of these three producers might result in the supply schedule shown in Figure 5.3b. The schedule shows each producer's individual supply per week and the resulting total market supply. The accompanying graph shows the same data as a market supply curve. Each point on the curve represents a quantity of tacos supplied at a given price. As you might expect, the graph does show a clear relationship between price and supply of tacos. Jasmine's supply curve and the market supply curve share an important similarity in both. The quantity of tacos supplied increases as the price of tacos increases. As the price decreases, the quantity supplied decreases. Price and quantity move in the same direction. Economists refer to this direct relationship between price and quantity as the law of supply. The law of supply holds true as long as all other influencers on supply remain constant. Why do price and quantity supplied move in the same direction? Economists cite two main reasons: production decisions by existing producers and market entries and exits. In a market-based economy, every producer's primary goal is to maximize profits. Firms earn profits based partly on revenue, the amount of money received in the course of doing business. Bringing in more revenue is likely to increase profits. So when prices increase, the desire to make a profit leads producers to increase their production of goods. They expect their profits to increase as a result. Likewise, when prices fall, producers are likely to cut production. When the price of a good or service increases, new firms may enter a market because they see the potential for profit. For example, a building firm might enter the housing construction market to take advantage of rising home prices. Suppose the firm were to build 20 new homes and offer them for sale at $500,000 each. This would increase the quantity of houses supplied at that price. The reverse can also happen when prices drop. Producers may exit the market, exit it, decreasing the quantities supplied at certain prices. The law of supply tells us that producers react in predictable ways to a change in the price of a good or service. As producers supply more at higher prices and less at lower prices, the quantity supplied is said to move along the supply curve. Economists call this movement along the curve as a change in quantity supplied. The only factor that causes a change in quantity supplied is price. As the law of supply recognizes, price is important to producers when they are deciding how much of a good or service to offer for sale. But just as many factors can influence demand, factors other than price can also influence supply. Think about what would happen if Jasmine were to close her taqueria. The market supply of tacos would decrease at all prices. If a new taqueria were to open, the market supply of tacos would increase at all prices. What would these changes in supply look like on a graph? When the price of a product changes, the quantity supplied moves along the supply curve. But often a variable other than price, such as a change in the number of producers, can cause market supply at all prices to increase or decrease. Economists call this a change in supply. A change in supply causes the entire supply curve to shift to a new position. The graph in Figure 5.4 illustrates this supply curve shift. Schedule in Figure 0.4 contains market supply data for our imaginary taco market. The original market supply of tacos is shown in the middle column. The decrease and increase in market supply are shown in the columns to the left and right. The three supply curves on the graph correspond to the three market supply schedules. The original market supply data were used to plot the supply curve in the middle. The supply curve on the left shows the decrease in quantity supplied at every price, and the supply curve on the right shows the increase in quantity supplied at every price. These changes in supply cause the entire supply curve to move. When this happens, when a factor other than price causes the quantity supplied at every price to change, economists say that the supply curve has shifted. When the supply increases, the supply curve shifts to the right. When supply decreases, the supply curve shifts to the left. Economists point to several factors that can cause a change in supply of a good or service. Six of these supply shifters are listed below. Although we will examine each supply shifter as if it were interdependent of the rest, ceteris paribus, remember that everything is interconnected. Any change in the cost of a factor of production, land, labor, or capital, will result in a change in the market supply of a product. Profit is the key to this process. Lower production costs increase profits. Higher profits are an incentive to produce more. Thus, a decrease in production costs causes an increase in supply. The supply curve shifts to the right in the same way an increase in production costs causes a demand in supply. For example, an increase in the price of coltan, a metallic one used in the manufacture of electronic devices, would cause cell phone production costs to increase. Profits would go down. The quantity of cell phones that producers would be willing and able to supply at all prices would likely decrease. In this case, the supply curve would shift to the left. Another factor that affects supply is the number of producers in a market. Producers enter a market when they think there is a profit to be made. This happened when lightweight tablet computers were brought to market. The iPad, introduced by Apple in 2010, was the first tablet to enjoy robust sales. Its success attracted many other producers into the tablet market. The market supply of tablets increased dramatically. Natural disasters such as hurricanes, floods, and wildfires can decrease supply. Consider what would happen to the supply of corn if a sudden corn snap were to wipe out half the Midwest's corn crop. Supply would decrease. Producers of corn would supply fewer goods at every price. International crises such as wars and revolutions can have a similar effect. For example, what if a rebel group were to block the main point of a major copper-producing country? Firms producing copper wire and copper pipes would supply smaller quantities at every price. Technological advances can also reduce the amount of labor needed to produce a good, which it can reduce the amount of labor needed to produce a good, thereby lowering costs and increasing productivity. A prime example of this kind of technology is the robot. Autonomous manufacturers today use thousands of robots for spot welding, painting, assembly, and other tasks. This technology allows automakers to produce more vehicles with the same amount of human labor. This in turn lowers the cost of production, which leads to an increase in supply. Producers often make supply decisions based on the expectation that prices will rise or fall. For example, what if wheat farmers were offered a lower than average price for their crop? Farmers might take part of their crop off the market and put it into storage, expecting higher prices in the future. Wheat farmers would supply less to the market today. The supply curve for wheat would shift to the left. Expectations that future prices will fall leads to the opposite effect. Producers supply more to the market in the short term of an effort to make a profit before prices decrease. Governments can directly apply supply, affecting supply in two ways. One is by offering producers a subsidy, a cash payment aimed at helping a producer to continue to operate. The U.S. government, for example, pays large subsidies to farmers. Farm subsidies do not necessarily increase supply. However, sometimes farmers are paid not to farm their land or keep supply low and prices high. Governments also use excess taxes to reduce the supply of certain goods. An excess tax is a tax on a manufacture or sale of a good. It adds to the production cost of every unit produced, thereby causing supply to decrease. You no doubt already have a good idea of what elasticity means in the everyday world. Rubber bands and bungee cords come immediately to mind. In the world of economics, elasticity retains this idea of stretchiness. Economists define elasticity as the degree to which a quantity demanded or a quantity supplied changes in response to a change in price. The degree of elasticity tells economists how responsive consumers and producers will be to a change in the price of a good or service. The economist Alfred Marshall first developed the idea that demand is elastic more than a century ago. He introduced the term elasticity to describe the way quantity demanded responds to changes in price. Economists since Marshall have referred to elasticity of demand as a measure of consumer sensibility to a change in price. How sensitive are you to price changes? The answer most likely depends on what you want to buy. If the price of toothpaste were to increase by 50%, for example, would you probably buy it anyway? The demand for necessities like toothpaste tends to be inelastic, meaning that it responds slightly or not at all to a change in price. In contrast, if your favorite energy bars were marked up by 50%, you might decide to buy something else instead. Your demand in this case would be elastic or responsive to a change in price. To an economist, the terms elastic and inelastic have precise mathematical definitions. To calculate the degree of elasticity of demand, economists use the following formula. Demand elasticity equals percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in price. If the result of this calculation is greater than 1, demand is said to be elastic. If the result is less than 1, demand is inelastic. In Figure 5.5, you can see how these calculations work out for the toothpaste and energy bar examples you read about previously. Figure 5.5 also illustrates How elasticity can be graphed using a demand curve. The first graph shows a demand curve for toothpaste. A 50% increase in the price of toothpaste produces only a 10% decrease in the quantity demanded. The result is a demanded curve with a steep slope. The quantity of toothpaste demanded moves only slightly along the steep curve when the price increases or decreases. The second graph shows a demand curve for energy bars. Here, a 50% increase in price produces an 80% decrease in the quantity demanded. The resultant demand curve with a flatter slope. The quantity of bars demanded moves much farther along this curve in response to price changes than is the case with toothpaste. Economists use several terms to describe the degrees of elasticity. In addition to elastic and inelastic, they speak of perfectly elastic, perfectly inelastic, and unitary elastic. Unitary elastic demand occurs when the percentage changes in price exactly equals the percentage changes in the quantity demanded. The result of the elasticity calculations in such instances is exactly 1. The only way to know for certain whether a demand curve is elastic or inelastic is to plug the percentages into the formula and do the math. But, as a general rule of thumb, the flatter the curve, the more likely it is that demand is elastic. The steeper the curve, the more likely it is that demand is inelastic. Knowing how elastic demand is for various goods can help producers price their products at a level that maximizes their revenue. To gauge the impact of prices on their revenue, producers use a business tool known as the total revenue test. To measure the elasticity of demand for toothpaste, for example, a producer uses the total revenue test that would create a revenue table. Like a market demand schedule, a revenue table lists the possible prices for a given product and the market demand at each price. But it has an additional column for total revenue at each price level. Total revenue is calculated by multiplying the quantity of a good sold by the price of the good. For example, a toothpaste producer who sells 22,000 tubes of toothpaste per week at a price of $2 per tube earns a total revenue of $44,000 per week. The revenue table for toothpaste shows that as the price of toothpaste increases, total revenue also increases. The response to price changes tell us that demand for toothpaste in this market is inelastic. Even a large change in price leads to a relatively small change in the quantity demanded. In this case, toothpaste producers can maximize their total revenue by selling fewer units of toothpaste at higher prices. The revenue table for energy bars tells a different story. It shows that as the price of the bars increases, total revenue decreases. The demand for energy bars in this market is very elastic. A small change in price leads to a large change in the quantity demanded. The producer will earn a higher total revenue by selling more energy bars at lower prices. Any producer thinking about changing the price of a product needs to know whether demand for that product is inelastic or elastic. When demand is inelastic, price and total revenue move up in the same direction. When the demand is elastic, price and total revenue move in opposite directions. Why is consumer demand more elastic for some goods than for others? The following factors help economists predict the elasticity of demand for a good or service. Demand for products that have chose substitutes tends to be elastic. If the price of a sports drink goes up, for example, many consumers will switch to bottled juice or water. Chocolate, however, has no closer substitutes. When its price increases, most consumers continue to buy it. Demand for chocolate is inelastic. Consumers are more responsive to changes in prices when buying a big ticket items, which eat up more income than when making minor purchases. If you were considering buying a computer, for example, a price decrease of 20% might very well motivate you to buy. Your demand in this case would be elastic. Your demand for an expensive item like soap, however, would be inelastic. You might not even notice if its price were to increase or decrease 20%. When a product is perceived as a necessity, demand for it tends to be highly inelastic. Demand for luxuries, in contrast, is elastic. People will always buy food and necessity, even if prices increase. Luxuries like fancy watches, on the other hand, are goods we can live without. If the price goes up, we can easily stop buying them. Elasticity of demand can change over time. When gas prices increased sharply in 2011, many people found it difficult to reduce their gas consumption in response. They still needed gas to drive to work, shop, and get around. Over time, however, people adjusted to the price rise. They formed carpools, began using public transportation, and bought smaller cars that used less fuel. As they did so, the demand for gas gradually became more elastic. Economists apply the principle of elasticity to supply in the same way they apply it to demand. Elasticity of supply is a measure of the sensitivity of producers to a change in price. It tells economists how much a product will change the quantity supplied in response to a change in price. The laws of supply tells us that the quantity supplied moves in the same direction as price. As prices rise, producers are motivated to increase production levels in the hope of making higher profits. Thus, a producer whose supply is elastic will likely respond to an increase in price with an increase in quantity supplied. Ice cream makers, for example, are flexible producers. They can churn out more ice cream fairly easily in response to even a small increase in price. They can also slow production just as quickly if the price of ice cream decreases. The supply of ice cream in this case is relatively elastic. Not so for antiques. the supply of genuine antiques is limited, and their numbers do not increase much over time. An antique dealer cannot simply create more antiques to take advantage of increasing prices. Antiques dealers are not very responsive to changes in price because their supply is inelastic. The supply of bananas may be equally inelastic, but for different reasons. Growers can increase the quantity supplied by expanding their banana plantations, but there will be a lag time between planting new banana trees and harvesting more fruit. Until the new plantations begin to produce, the supply of bananas will remain relatively inelastic. Economists calculate elasticity of supply the same way they do demand, using the following formula. Supply elasticity, percentage change in quantity supplied, percentage changes in price. If the result is greater than 1, supply is said to be elastic. If the result is less than 1, it is inelastic. If the result is exactly 1, the percentage change in price equals the percentage change in quantity supplied. The result is unitary elastic supply. In figure 5.6, you can see how these calculations work out for yogurt and bananas. Figure 5.6 also illustrates how elasticity of supply can be graphed using a supply curve. The first graph shows a supply curve for bananas. You can see that even a 50% rise in the price of bananas yields a relatively small change in the quantity supplied. The result is a supply curve with a steep slope. The quantity of bananas supplied moves only slightly along the steep curve when the price increases or decreases. The second graph shows a supply curve for yogurt. Here, a 50% change in price causes a relatively large change in the quantity supplied. The result is a supply curve with a flatter slope. The quantity of yogurt supplied moves farther along this curve in response to price changes than is the case with bananas. As with demand curves, economists classify supply curves according to their degree of elasticity. The only way to know for certain whether a supply curve is elastic or inelastic is to run the numbers. But as a general rule, we can say that the flatter the supply curve on a graph, the more likely it is to that the supply is elastic. The steeper the curve on a graph, the more likely it is that the supply is inelastic. Why is the supply of some goods elastic and other goods inelastic? Several things can influence the elasticity of supply at different points along the supply chain. The supply chain is the network of people, organizations, and activities involved in supplying goods and services to consumers. The supply chain begins with the delivery of needed inputs to the producer, continues through the production process and ends with the distribution of the finished product to consumers. Along the path of the supply chain, supply can be affected by any or all of the following factors: the availability of inputs, nobility of inputs, storage capacity, and the time needed to adjust to a price change. Are the inputs needed at the beginning of the supply chain readily available? If the answer is yes, then supply of the product based on those inputs will probably be elastic. Suppliers can offer more or less of the good or service in response to a price change without too much trouble. If key raw materials or other essential inputs are less available, supply is likely to be inelastic. The supply of medical care is a good example. The most important input for good medical care is a trained physician. Medical schools turn out only so many new doctors each year. Producing more in response to a sudden rise in fees for medical services would be difficult. The ease with which inputs and products move through the supply chain also affects elasticity. A new highway, for example, might cut the time needed to ship oats, soybeans, and other inputs from farmers to the manufacturing plants when energy bars are produced. As a result, energy bar producers would be able to respond more quickly to changes in the price of energy bars. How easy is it to store products as they move through the supply chain has an impact on elasticity as well. Toothpaste, for example, can easily be stored in distribution center warehouses. Producers can readily hold back on supply or supply more tubes in response to price changes. Bananas, in contrast, are perishable. This makes it harder for producers to adjust their supply as prices change. The supply of many products is inelastic when the price actually changes, but it may become more elastic with the passage of time. The supply of bananas, for example, may be inelastic in the short run, but given enough time, banana producers will increase or decrease their future production or to adjust to eventual changes in the price of bananas. At this point in your life, you probably do not have to worry about such factors as the mobility of inputs or storage capacity. The key thing to remember now is that the two most important forces in a market economy are demand and supply. Consumers, also looking for a bargain, are generally willing to demand more when the price goes down. On the other hand, producers, always looking to increase profits, are generally willing to supply more when the price goes up. Consumers and producers both look to protect their own best interests. Later on, you will understand how demand interacts with supply to determine what you pay for the goods and services you want most. To summarize, demand and supply are the two forces that make market-based economies work. Demand reflects what consumers are willing and able to purchase at various prices. Supply reflects what producers are willing and able to produce at various prices. Price is related to the quantity of goods that consumers want and producers will provide. Although other variables can have a significant influence as well, economists use elasticity as a tool for measuring how responsive consumers and producers are to price changes. The law of demand states that as the price of a good or service increases, the quantity demand decreases. As the price decreases, the quantity demand increases. The inverse relationship of quantity demanded and price can be shown in a demand schedule and graphed as a demand curve. Demand in a market changes when quantities demanded at all prices increase or decrease. On a graph, a change in demand causes the demand curve to shift. Significant demand shifters include income, the number of consumers, and the price of substitutes. The law of supply states that as the price of a good or service increases, the quantity supply increases. As the price decreases, the quantity supply decreases. The direct relationship of quantity supplied and price can be shown in a supply schedule and graphed at a supply curve. Supply in a market changes when quantities supplied at all prices increase or decrease. On a graph, a change in supply causes the supply curve to shift. Significant supply shifters include cost of inputs, number of producers, and new technology. Demand elasticity is a measure of how responsive consumers are to change in prices. Demand elasticity is influenced by such factors as the availability of substitutes, the product's price relative to income, whether the product is a necessity or a luxury, and the time needed to adjust to a price change. Supply elasticity is a measure of how responsive producers are to change in price. Supply elasticity is influenced by such factors as the availability and mobility of inputs, a producer's storage capacity, and the time needed to adjust to a price change.